Hazel Cross inherited a library worth $2,800. The central system got the budget, the newer branches, and 40 years of her work. She got a closure notice and a building the city wanted emptied by the end of the month. She went in alone on a Tuesday morning. With a box of trash bags and a thermos of coffee she forgot to drink. What she found in the archive room beneath those floors had been locked since 1962. And the woman who built it had been gone for 11 years, still waiting for the right person to find it. At 58, after 30 years shelving books in a building the county had appraised at $2,800 and already decided to abandon, Hazel Cross received the closure notice for the Berea Branch Library in an email sent at 4:52 on a Friday afternoon. The subject line read, "Branch Consolidation. Action required." She read it at the kitchen table with her reading glasses still on from the crossword. She read it twice. Then she set her phone face down on the table and finished the last 3 squares of the puzzle. She already knew the answer to 26 across. She had known it for 10 minutes. She just hadn't written it in yet. The email was from Bradford Hayes, Director of Operations, Madison County Public Library System. It was copied to the full City Council, the County Budget Committee, the Parks and Recreation Director, and someone named D. Albright in the Facilities Management Office whose name Hazel had never seen before and would not see again. 9 recipients in the CC line. The branch staff had not been among them. Hazel was the branch staff. She had been the branch staff for 30 years. The email was 4 paragraphs. The first explained that the Madison County Public Library System was undergoing a strategic consolidation of service locations in response to shifting patron usage patterns and ongoing fiscal pressures. The second noted that the Berea branch, located at 114 Chestnut Street, had seen a 34% decline in foot traffic over the preceding 5 years and no longer met the system's minimum threshold for continued independent operation. The third outlined a timeline. The branch would close to the public in 3 weeks. All collection materials were to be assessed for redistribution or decommission. The building itself would revert to County Facilities Management for evaluation. The 4th paragraph thanked Hazel for her years of service to the community and directed her to contact Human Resources regarding separation benefits. She read the phrase shifting patron usage patterns and thought about Agnes Wheeler, who came in every Tuesday and Thursday without fail, who had been coming in every Tuesday and Thursday for 50 years, who had her own chair at the reading table by the east window and knew where the large print mysteries were kept better than Hazel did. She thought about the after-school kids who came in on Wednesdays because their parents worked second shift and the branch was warm and had outlets and nobody asked them to buy anything. She thought about the man who came in every first Monday of the month to use the computer for his VA appointments because he didn't have internet at home and the branch never made him sign up in advance. Shifting patron usage patterns. Hazel picked her phone back up. She opened the email. She forwarded it to Agnes Wheeler. She did not type anything in the body of the forward. She did not add a subject note. She pressed send and set the phone down again and looked at the window over the sink where the light was coming in at a low angle the way it did in November, flat and pale, and she thought that she had been meaning to replace the caulking around that window since March and had not gotten around to it and probably would not now. She was not surprised. That was the part she would think about later, in the archive room, on the floor with the documents spread around her. That she had not been surprised. That somewhere between the first paragraph and the 4th she had felt something she recognized. Something she had been half expecting without knowing she was expecting it. A kind of completed sentence she'd been waiting on without realizing she had been holding her breath. Berea was that kind of town. You learned to expect the thing you couldn't afford to lose to eventually be taken. Bradford Hayes had been director for 8 years. Before that, he had been assistant director for 3, and before that, he had been a budget analyst for a regional consulting firm in Lexington that specialized in what they called municipal resource optimization. He was 51 years old and drove a dark green Subaru and wore the same brand of fleece quarter zip in rotation, different colors, all of them slightly too large in the shoulders. He was not unkind in person. That was the thing Hazel had always found disorienting about him. In meetings, he listened carefully and nodded at the right moments and said things like, "I hear that, and I want to make sure we're addressing the underlying concern here." He was the kind of person who used the word optics without irony and believed, genuinely believed, that he was making the system better. He had cut the branch budget 3 times in 4 years. Each time he had sent Hazel a document with charts and footnotes and a section at the end titled Path Forward that described ways the branch could increase its value proposition. She had read each document the same way she read the closure notice. Completely. quietly, without responding. The last cut had taken the branch from one full-time position to a part-time allocation. Hazel had absorbed the difference without telling anyone, coming in on her own time on the days the county wasn't paying her, because the alternative was closing 2 afternoons a week, and she was not going to close 2 afternoons a week. She had not claimed the hours. She had not told Bradford Hayes. She had simply done the work, the way she had always done the work, the way Margaret Oakes had done the work before her for 47 years in the same building before she retired in 2013 and died quietly of a stroke in her garden the following spring. Hazel had worked alongside Margaret for the last 8 years of Margaret's tenure. She had learned the building from her. The way the east door stuck in humid weather and needed a shoulder. The way the fluorescent light in the back corner flickered for 30 seconds before it caught and you just had to wait. The way the heat came on too strong in the first hour and then settled, and you opened the window in room 2 slightly before the patrons arrived, or it would be stifling by 10. Margaret had shown her where the supply closet key was kept, and which shelf in the reference section needed the bracket tightened, and how to reset the computer terminal when the system froze, which it did every few weeks, in a way that involved holding down 2 keys simultaneously that were not the ones described in the manual. She had never mentioned the archive room. In 30 years, Hazel had never been in the archive room. She had known it existed. There was a door at the bottom of the utility stairs, behind the shelving unit in the back hallway, locked with a mechanical combination lock that was older than the building's last renovation and possibly older than Hazel herself. Margaret had never explained it. Hazel had never asked. There were things about a building you inherited without inheriting the explanations, and you learned to understand that some doors were not yours to open until they were. She had not thought about that door in years. She forwarded the email to Agnes and finished her coffee, which had gone cold, and sat at the kitchen table for a while longer in the flat November light. Then she got up, rinsed her cup, and went to find where she had put the branch keys. She found the keys in the drawer by the front door where she kept things she needed to be able to locate without thinking. The branch key was on a ring with 2 others, a small brass tag stamped 114CH in handwriting that was not hers. Margaret had made that tag. Hazel had used the key for 30 years without looking at the tag closely enough to think about who had made it. She looked at it now. She drove to the branch on Saturday morning before the hardware store opened, before the coffee shop on the corner had its first customer, before anyone else on Chestnut Street had moved. She parked in the small lot behind the building and sat in the car for a moment. The light was coming up gray and thin. The maple at the corner of the lot had dropped most of its leaves, and they had matted against the base of the curb in a dark, wet layer. Someone had taped a paper notice to the back door that said "Permanently Closed. Madison CO Library SY STEM." The tape was already peeling at one corner. It had only been up since Friday. She got out of the car and unlocked the door. The smell hit her before the light did. Paper and dust and the particular cold of a building that had been heated for occupancy for decades and was now being allowed, for the first time, to cool. It was not an unpleasant smell. It was the smell of the place. She had been breathing it for 30 years and never named it and couldn't have described it to anyone who hadn't been inside. But she knew it the way you know the smell of your own house when you've been away for a week. It was just the smell of the branch. It was just what the building was. She stood in the back hallway with her coat on and did not turn on the lights for a minute. Then she did. The fluorescent in the back corner flickered for 30 seconds before it caught. She had not needed to think about that. Her hand had reached for the light panel and she had waited without deciding to wait, the way you wait for a familiar thing. She walked through the stacks. The collection was in the condition she had left it Friday afternoon, which was to say in good order, which was to say 30 years of good order, every spine aligned, every section labeled in the classification system she had maintained by hand after the county stopped paying for software updates 3 years ago. She ran one finger along the edge of the shelf in the 500S, the Natural Sciences, and looked at her finger, and the dust on it was minimal. She had dusted last Wednesday. She did not know why she had dusted last Wednesday. She had not known on Wednesday that it would be the last Wednesday. But she had dusted anyway, because that was what you did on Wednesdays. She went to the reading table by the east window, Agnes's table, and stood there for a moment. The chair was pushed in at a slight angle, the way Agnes always left it, not quite parallel to the table, her particular geometry, 47 years of the same angle of departure. Hazel straightened it. Then she thought about that, about straightening it, and left it alone. Her phone rang at 9:14. Agnes Wheeler did not say hello. She said, I got your email. Then she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, when? End of the month, Hazel said. Another silence. I have something for you, Agnes said. I've had it a long time. I think maybe I should have given it to you sooner, but I didn't know if it was the right time, and then I kept not knowing. What is it? Hazel said. A key, Agnes said. Margaret gave it to me in 2012. She said, give it to the next librarian when the time comes, and I said, how will I know when the time comes? And she said, you'll know. Hazel stood in the stacks with her phone against her ear and did not say anything. I think this is the time, Agnes said. Agnes Wheeler was 80 years old and had been coming to the Berea Branch Library since 1974, which was 3 years after it opened, which meant she had been coming almost as long as the branch had existed. She had been a school teacher for 31 years before she retired. She taught 4th grade. She had a particular way of sitting very still while she read, her hands flat on the table on either side of the book, that Hazel had always found quietly remarkable. A quality of attention that most people lost sometime around adolescence, and Agnes had apparently never put down. She arrived at the branch at 10 o'clock with a canvas tote bag over one arm and a key in her hand before she was fully through the door. The key was on a simple ring, no tag, the metal worn smooth with age. It was small, the kind made for a mechanical combination lock rather than a deadbolt, and it looked like it had been cut sometime in the middle of the last century. She handed it to Hazel without preamble. Margaret gave me this and said, don't lose it, and I did not lose it, Agnes said. She also said, don't go down there yourself, that it wasn't for me. I asked her what was down there, and she said, old business. I never asked again. Old business, Hazel said. That's what she said. Hazel turned the key over in her hand. It was heavier than it looked. The metal had a particular density that newer keys didn't have, a solidity, the way old things were made before the materials got thinner. She didn't know it yet, but that key was only half of what she needed. The other half had been hiding in the building for 30 years, in a place she had touched 1,000 times without knowing what she was touching. Do you know how long it's been locked? Hazel said. Agnes thought about it. She had been coming since 74, and the door had been locked then. She was sure of that. She remembered asking Margaret about it once, early on, and Margaret saying something about the archive, about things that needed to stay undisturbed until they needed to be disturbed. Agnes had been a school teacher. She understood that some answers were less important than learning to sit with the question. It was locked when I first came, Agnes said, so at least since 74. Maybe longer. Hazel looked at the key. The lock on the archive door had a small plate beside it, recessed into the doorframe, that she had never examined closely. She had passed it for 30 years. It had a date stamped into the metal. She had always assumed it was a manufacturing date, a serial number. Something administrative. She had not looked at it closely enough to read it. She thought about that now. They went to the back hallway together, Hazel and Agnes, and Hazel moved the shelving unit that stood in front of the archive door the way she had moved it every few years to check the baseboard for moisture. It was not heavy, a rolling unit. It just needed to be angled correctly to clear the door frame. She had done it a dozen times without thinking about what she was clearing the door to reach. The door was steel, painted the same institutional cream as the hallway walls, but dimmed now to something closer to the color of old paper. The combination lock was a mechanical dial type, the kind with a numbered face that you turned by hand, mounted in the center of the door at chest height. Below it, to the right, was the small plate she had always taken for a serial number. She leaned in and read it. Enstalled November 1962. M. O. Aches. She straightened up. Margaret had been hired in 1966. 4 years after this lock was installed. She looked at Agnes. Agnes said, she told me once that the room was here before she was, that she spent her first year figuring out what was in it and her last year figuring out who should have it next. Hazel stood there with the key in her hand. The lock had 3 dials. Agnes didn't know the combination. The key was for a secondary mechanism below the dial, a separate keyhole nearly hidden in the shadow of the lock plate. You needed both, Hazel understood now, looking at the key. The combination to release the bolts, the key to turn the final cylinder. She had only one. She said this to Agnes, standing in the back hallway with the key in her hand and the combination lock in front of her. Agnes looked at the lock. Then she opened her canvas tote and reached inside and took out a small envelope, the kind used for greeting cards, sealed with a strip of tape that had yellowed at the edges. She held it out to Hazel. I forgot about this, Agnes said. Or I didn't forget. I didn't Margaret gave it to me the same day she gave me the key. She said, "Open it," and open it. Not before. The envelope had been sealed for 11 years. Hazel took it. She turned it over. Her name was not on it. No name was on it. Just the envelope, small and plain, the tape holding it closed, the color of old paper. She opened it. Inside was a collar, the kind that comes with a florist's arrangement, 4 inches by 3. On one side, in Margaret's compressed handwriting, 3 numbers. That was all. Hazel looked at the numbers. She looked at the numbers. 3 dials, 0 3. She set the envelope on the shelf beside her and reached for the first number. She always said that. Hazel took the first dial left to the first number. To the second. Left to the top. She pressed the body of the lock inward the way the mechanism worked. She looked at Agnes said, "Again." Margaret said the same thing twice. Hazel reset the pressed. The click was small and definite, the sound of something that had been waiting a long time to move. She turned the key. The door opened inward on air that had been sealed since 1962. 62 years of stillness moving past them into the hallway, carrying the particular cold of a room that had held its breath for longer than either of them had been in this building. Agnes put her hand on the door frame. She did not go in. She said, "This part is yours." Hazel stepped through. What Hazel Cross found in that room wasn't what any of us expected. But looking back now, from the other side of everything that followed, it was the only thing that could have made sense. Given everything Margaret Oakes had spent 47 years building in the dark, one box at a time, for a girl she had met when that girl was 8 years old and couldn't afford to buy her own books, she stood in front of the archive door with the key in one hand and the number sequence in her memory and thought, "This is the part where it doesn't work." She had built up enough disappointment in the last 4 days that the protection was necessary. She had thought she would find the combination of the files. She had not. She had thought the county records might have something. They did not. She had thought about calling Margaret's daughter in Cincinnati and had decided against it because she could not explain, not really, what she was looking for. She set her hand on the dial. She turned it 2 full rotations, stopped on the first number, right, 1 rotation, to the second, left. She heard the bolts release, a clean, mechanical sound, low and certain, the sound of something built to last releasing after a very long time. She put the key in the secondary cylinder. She turned it. She pressed the door. The air that came out was different, cooler, still. It smelled like paper, old paper, not the dry institutional smell of the stacks upstairs, but something deeper, closer, the smell of documents that had been sealed rather than shelved, kept rather than searched. There was something else over there, faint, like wood polish and pencil shape. The soap she couldn't name but recognized without being in place. She found the light switch on the left side of the room, a single bulb, incandescent. The room was smaller than she expected, maybe 12 feet. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with metal shelving, old copper, dark green, the kind that had been standard in institutional buildings from the 40s through the 70s. Every shelf was full, banker's boxes, archival quality, brown, labeled in a hand she recognized immediately. Margaret's hand. Black marker, neat, consistent, dated. The labels went back to 1966. 47 years of labels. Every one of them in the same hand. Hazel stood in the doorway and looked at the room for a long time without going in. Then she took 1 step inside. On the shelf immediately to her left, at eye level, there was a single item that was not a banker's box. It was a smaller box, the kind used for index cards, pale green, the cardboard slightly bowed from age. A piece of white paper was taped to the lid. On the paper, in Margaret's handwriting, in ink rather than marker, it said, "Start here." She picked it up. She carried it to the small table in the center of the room that she had only just noticed. A folding table, the metal-legged kind, with 2 folding chairs tucked beneath it. The chairs were the same ones that had been in the branch workroom for as long as Hazel could remember. She had wondered 2 years ago where the second one had gone. She had assumed it had been removed by maintenance. She sat down. She set the index card box on the table. She opened it. Inside was a single index card. On it, in Margaret's hand, it said, found the room. That means you're supposed to. The boxes are organized by year. Start with 1966 if you want to understand what this is. Start with the last box on the bottom right shelf if you want to understand why you're the one sitting there. Hazel read the card twice. She set it down. She looked at the room around her, the 47 years of labeled boxes, the single bulb above her, the smell of sealed paper and old wood. She looked at the last box on the bottom right shelf. She did not move toward it yet. The first item beneath the letter was a ledger, standard composition size, black cover, the kind sold in any office supply store. The spine was reinforced with electrical tape, black over black, almost invisible. The pages were clear. They were full. Everything. The handwriting was Margaret's, smaller than the letters, compressed, fitting as much as possible into each line. Hazel opened it to the first page. The heading said, Textbook Fund, 1970. Below it, a list. Names, dates, amounts, subjects. First column, the child's name and grade. Second column, the book or book's name. Third column, the cost. Fourth column, a date, which Hazel understood after a moment was the date the book had been delivered to the child, and a notation beside it, always the same, always 3 letters, received. The first entry was dated September 8th, 1971. A 6th grade girl, 2 textbooks, $14.30, received September 11th. The second was September 12th, a 3rd grade boy, 1 workbook, $4.80, received September 15th. She turned the pages slowly. The entries continued through the school year, paused in June, resumed in September, every year. The amounts changed as costs rose. The names changed as children aged out and new children came. But the format never changed, and the notation never changed. Received. Received. A confirmation, written down, that the book had gotten to the child. She turned further. 1991. A 7th grade boy, Marcus Webb, 3 textbooks, $22.40, received September 9th. She turned to the last entries, 2013, March. The last entry was dated March 18th, 2013, 3 weeks before Margaret retired. A 2nd grade girl, one beginning, $6.15, received March 21st. She closed the ledger. She set it on the table beside the letter. Below the receipts was a sealed with a date written on the outside in marker, 1997. Inside were photocopied documents, bank statements, deposits. The account was in Margaret's name, a savings account at a Berea bank that no longer existed, absorbed into a regional chain sometime in the early 2000s. The deposits were regular, modest, sometimes as little as $8, sometimes as much as $4, monthly, sometimes twice monthly. Going back, in this envelope, to 1970, Hazel understood what she was doing. She understood that she understand something already new, but had not yet been given permission. The branch had never had a textbook. There was no line item in any budget she had ever seen for direct student support. The money that had bought those books, 47 years ago, had come from somewhere that was not the county, not the library system, not any grant or endowment she had ever paid. It had come from the account in this envelope. It had come from Margaret Oates' own salary, deposited piece by piece, $8 at a time, for 47 years. She set the envelope down. She looked at the brown folder at the bottom of the box. She reached in and took it out. The folder was thin. Inside was a single document, printed on library letterhead, dated 2013. It was titled Barra Branch Library. Patron Record, Supplemental Series, 1966 to 2013. Below the title was a note in Margaret's hand, 312 names. Every child who came through this branch without enough. I knew each one. I want someone to know I knew. Below that, the list began. It was typed, double-spaced, alphabetical by last name. Each entry gave a name, a first year of contact, a brief note, and in some cases a follow-up line that said where they had gone, what they had become, written in pencil in the margins in a hand that had clearly returned to the list over years. Hazel ran her finger down the page. She was not looking for herself. She found herself anyway. Cross, Hazel, 1970, 8 years old, reads everything. In the margin, set the folder down on the table. She did not look for the time. The light above her, the furnace moved. Somewhere in the building, the east door moved slightly in its frame, the way it did in cold weather when the pressure changed. A small familiar sound she had heard for 30 years and would have recognized anywhere. She put her hands flat on the table. She sat in the folding chair in the 40-watt light in the sealed room and felt the specific weight of finding out that you had been held up, quietly, from a distance, by someone who had never told you and never intended to tell you, and that the holding had worked, and that you had become exactly what that person had seen in you. When you were 8 years old and you couldn't reach the wall. She sat there for a moment. Then she reached for the folder, opened it, and looked at the list from behind her. All 312 names had started. She read the list twice through before she looked at it. 312 names. The earliest entry was dated 1966. A boy named Thomas Aldrich, 7 years ago, first grade. The most recent was the second grade girl from March 2013, $6.15. Between them, 47 years of children who had come through the branch without enough, which was Margaret's phrase, and which Hazel understood now as the most precise description possible. Not without money, exactly, though that was part of it. Without enough. Without the specific enough that a child needs to keep going, to stay curious, to not decide at age 8 or 10 or 12 that reading is something other people do, that books are not for them, that the door is locked and they don't have the key. Margaret had been the key for 47 years, without telling anyone. She went to the shelves. She went to 1966 first. The box for 1966 contained the official records, budget documents, circulation logs, correspondence with the Central Library, staff schedules. It was orderly and complete and told the story of an institution finding its footing, a new branch in a small Kentucky town, modest circulation numbers, modest budget, the ordinary beginning of something that would either matter or not, depending entirely on the people inside. She put the 1966 box back. She pulled the box for 1989, same official records, but something else too, tucked at the back behind the circulation numbers. A second ledger, smaller, the kind used for personal accounts. This one had no label on the cover. Inside, in the same compressed handwriting, was a different kind of record. Not textbooks, repairs, a window latch replaced, a shelf bracket reinforced, a section of floor tile, a light fixture rewired. Each entry had a date, a description, a cost, and a notation. Paid personal. Paid personal. Margaret had been paying for building repairs out of her own salary since at least 1989. The box for 1982 had the same kind of secondary ledger. The box for 1975 had one too. She stopped checking at 1973 when the ledger showed the first entry. A gutter repair, $18. Paid personal, July 9th, 1973. 7 years into her tenure. She had been paying for the building's maintenance out of her own pocket for at least 40 years. Hazel stood in the middle of the room with the 1973 ledger in her hands and thought about the county budget meetings she had attended in the last decade, the annual requests for basic maintenance funding, the spreadsheets Bradford Hayes sent back with items highlighted in yellow indicating deferral to the following fiscal year. She thought about the east door that stuck in humid weather. She thought about the fluorescent light in the back corner that she had always assumed was just old. She opened the box for 1989 again and looked at the repair log entries until she found it. August 14th, 1989. East door, frame warped, planed, and rehung. Paid personal. $19.40. Margaret had fixed the east door. The door still stuck. It had stuck for 35 years since Margaret fixed it, developing a new warp, the building settling into itself the way old buildings do. But Margaret had fixed it once and Hazel had managed it ever since without knowing why it stuck, without knowing that the original problem had already been solved once by the same woman who had sealed this room and hidden a key with Agnes Wheeler and written a name on a list in 1978 and waited. She put the ledger back. She went to the shelf where the banker's boxes for the last 8 years were stored, the years of Bradford Hayes. She pulled 2015, the second year of his directorship, and opened it. The official records for 2015 were what she expected. Budget documents, correspondence, the first round of cuts. She had lived through those cuts. She knew what they looked like from the outside. She was looking now at what they looked like from inside the record. Behind the official records in the 2015 box was something that was not a secondary ledger. was a folder, manila, thin. On the tab, in a hand that was close to Margaret's but not quite Margaret's, someone who had studied her handwriting carefully enough to replicate its general character but not its specific rhythm. Someone else had maintained the system after Margaret left. Hazel stood very still. She opened the folder. Inside were printed documents, bank statements, but not Margaret's account. A different account. An account in the name of the Berea Branch Library Community Fund, which had never appeared in any budget document she had seen in 30 years, which apparently existed at a regional credit union on the east side of town. The statements went back to 2014. The account had been opened 6 months after Margaret's death. The opening deposit was $41,947. Hazel looked at that number for a long moment. She turned to the next page. Deposits, monthly, for 9 years. Some months, $200. Some months, $400. Some months, nothing. The pattern was irregular in amount but consistent in origin. Every deposit came from the same source. The notation on each line said, Hayes B. Personal. Bradford Hayes. She read it again. Bradford Hayes had been making personal deposits into a community fund account connected to the Berea Branch Library for 9 years. The same Bradford Hayes who had cut the branch budget 3 times, who had sent the closure notice on a Friday afternoon copied to 9 recipients. She turned to the next page, looking for withdrawals, and found them, regular withdrawals, and the notations beside them stopped her completely. Textbook Fund, Berea Elementary. Textbook Fund, Berea Middle. Supply Fund, after-school program. He had known. Bradford Hayes had known about the textbook fund, had found the archive room, had read the boxes, and had continued it, quietly, on his own, from his own salary, the same way Margaret had, and had cut the branch budget anyway, and had closed the branch anyway. Hazel sat down on the floor of the archive room with the folder in her hands and looked at the statements and tried to hold both things at once. The man who had sent the closure notice. The man who had been continuing Margaret Oakes's work in secret for 9 years. She tried to find the place where those two things connected, the logic that contained both of them, and she found it, slowly, the way you find something you don't entirely want to find. He believed the building wasn't the point. He believed what Margaret had believed, about the books, about the children, about the specific enough that kept a kid in school. He had read the boxes. He had understood what the branch was actually for. And he had concluded, in the particular way that budget analysts from Lexington conclude things, that the function could be preserved without the form, that you could keep the textbook fund running without keeping the building open. He was wrong about that. Hazel believed he was wrong about that completely. But he was not indifferent. He was not cruel. He was, in the most complicated and difficult way, trying. If you've made it this far into Hazel's story, hit subscribe. Because what I found next is the part I have been waiting to tell you. She stayed on the floor of the archive room for a while. Then she got up, put the folder back in the 2015 box, and went through the remaining years. 2016 through 2022. Each one had the same folder, the same account statements, the same pattern of deposits and withdrawals. The amounts had grown over the years. By 2022, the monthly deposit was reliably $614, and the withdrawals were going to 4 schools and 2 after-school programs. In the 2022 box, she found something she had not found in the earlier ones, a second folder, thinner. Inside was a single document, a photocopy of a county budget request, annotated by hand in a pen she didn't recognize. The annotations were not administrative comments. They were questions. Why was line item 14C reduced 3 years running? Why was the maintenance allocation for Chestnut Street half the standard rate? Why was there no record of the 2018 exterior repair bids in the county procurement files? The questions were specific. The questions were the right questions. She turned the document over. On the back, in the same unfamiliar hand, talked to B. Hayes, March 4th. He says the fund is legitimate, that he started it after he found the old records, that he wanted to continue what had been done before. Confirmed 3 schools, 2 programs, 9 years of receipts. He also said he's been paying the branch maintenance shortfall out of his own budget allocation since 2019. I don't know what to do with him. He's closing the branch with one hand and holding it together with the other. I asked him why, and he said, the building is a liability. I said, the building is the point. He said, I know. He said it like he already knew he was wrong. He said it like he'd been saying it to himself for a long time. Below that, a signature she did not recognize, and a date, March 7th, 2023. Someone else had been here. Someone had been in this room before her, had found the same boxes, had talked to Bradford Hayes, had written this note and put it back in the folder and left it for the next person to find. She went back to the shelves. She found the box labeled 2019. The folder in the 2019 box was thicker than the others. Inside were the bank statements, and beneath them, a set of photocopied documents from the county procurement office. Purchase orders, maintenance contracts, vendor invoices for library system properties. She sorted through them until she found the ones for 114 Chestnut Street. The invoices were for work that had been billed to the county but apparently never performed. 3 exterior repair contracts between 2016 and 2018, issued to a company called Blue Ridge Facilities Group. She had never heard of Blue Ridge Facilities Group. She had been in the branch every week during those years, and she had not seen any exterior repair work performed. The east wall had needed repointing since at least 2015. She had submitted the request herself. The work had never been done. She turned to the next document. Blue Ridge Facilities Group was registered with the Kentucky Secretary of State's office. The registration was dated 2015. The managing member, listed on the operating agreement that someone had photocopied and placed in this folder, was a name she did know. D. Albright, the facilities management contact in Bradford Hayes' closure email. The name she had seen once and not thought about again. She set the document down. She thought about the closure email. The 9 recipients in the CC line. The one name she hadn't recognized. D. Albright had been billing the county for maintenance work at Berea Branch Library that was never performed for at least 3 years, while Bradford Hayes had been paying the actual maintenance costs himself, apparently to cover the discrepancy, apparently because he had found out about the ghost contracts and had not reported them, and had instead been quietly subsidizing the building to conceal the fact that the money allocated for its repair had been stolen. He had been protecting someone, or protecting himself, or both. She turned to the next document. The total billed by Blue Ridge Facilities Group across 7 years was $89,412. Every invoice was for work at Berea Branch Library. None of the work had been done. She said the number quietly in the archive room, not to anyone, just to hear it in the air. $89,412 taken from a library system over 7 years, from a budget that had been too small to begin with, while Bradford Hayes cut allocations and deferred maintenance and simultaneously deposited $614 a month of his own money into a community fund to buy textbooks for children. She did not know what to call that. She thought about Bradford Hayes in the quarterly meetings, his fleece quarter zip in rotation, his careful listening, his "I hear that." She thought about the way he had nodded when she talked about the after-school program. She had read it as administrative politeness. She understood now that it might have been the attention of someone who knew the value of what they were describing and had made a calculation about it that they could not explain in the room. She thought about the note on the back of the document. He said, "I know." He said it like he already knew he was wrong. She put the documents back in order. Then she went to the folding table and took out her phone. She typed an email to Bradford Hayes carefully, the way she did everything carefully. She wrote, "I've been in the archive room. I've read the boxes. All of them. I'd like to meet." She did not say she had seen the bank statements. She did not say she had seen the Blue Ridge documents. She let the documentation speak for itself, the way Margaret would have, the way you do when the record is complete, and the truth is already in there if you read it carefully enough. She sent the email. His reply came in 11 minutes. It said, "I know. I've been expecting this. Tomorrow, 9 in the morning, the branch. I'll bring the rest." She read the reply twice. She set the phone down on the table. The rest. There was more. She sat in the archive room until the 40-watt bulb above her felt like the right amount of light for what she was thinking. Then she packed the boxes carefully, resealed the lid with fresh tape she found in the supply ledger from 1987, where Margaret had noted a roll of archival tape, positioned B4 on the 3rd shelf, and the tape was still there, slightly brittle but usable, the way things built for the long term are still usable when you need them. She turned off the light. She pulled the archive door closed behind her and heard the bolts engage. She stood in the back hallway for a moment in the dark. Then she walked upstairs, through the stacks, past Agnes's table by the east window, through the back hallway past the fluorescent that flickered for 30 seconds before it caught, and out through the door that still remembered the repair Margaret Oakes had made 35 years ago into the November afternoon. Bradford Hayes arrived at 9:07 the next morning with a cardboard box under one arm and a look on his face that she recognized, not from him, but from the archive room, the look of a person who had been saying something to themselves for a long time and had finally reached the end of the saying. He set the box on the circulation desk. He did not sit down. He said, "How much did you find?" "Everything in the room," Hazel said, "and the Blue Ridge documents." He was quiet for a long time. He looked at the stacks. He looked at Agnes's table by the east window. He looked at the floor. He said, "I found the room in 2015. After I sent the first round of cuts, I was doing a building assessment for the consolidation study, and I found the lock, and I found the archive. I read the boxes over 3 weeks. Every box." Hazel waited. He said, "I didn't know what to do with it. I understood what she had done. I understood what the branch was. And I had already signed off on the first cuts. I couldn't undo that without explaining why, and I couldn't explain why without explaining about Albright. And I hadn't decided yet what to do about Albright." His jaw worked. He did not look up. She said, "Tell me about Albright." He said, "Dennis Albright had been in facilities management for 12 years when I came in. The ghost contracts were already running. I found them in the second year. I confronted him. He said he had documentation that implicated my predecessor in the original setup, and that if I moved against him, he would use it. I didn't know if the documentation was real. I still don't. I made a choice that I have been making every year since, and it is not a choice I can explain in a way that makes it sound like anything other than what it was." "What was it?" Hazel said. He picked up the box. He set it on the circulation desk between them. Inside was a file, 9 years of records, the bank statements from the community fund account, the receipts from the textbook distributions, correspondence with all 4 schools and both after-school programs, and at the back, a separate envelope, sealed, with a name on the outside. The name was D. Albright. Inside the envelope were the documents Bradford Hayes had spent 9 years assembling. Vendor registration records, canceled checks, procurement signatures, a timeline, precise and sourced, that started in 2012 and ran to the present. $89,412 fully documented. Every invoice, every payment, the paper trail complete. He had built the case himself. Quietly. Over 9 years. The way a person builds something when they cannot move yet but refuse to do nothing. Hazel held the envelope. She said, "Why now?" He said, "Because you're here. Because you found the room. Because she left it for you and you found it, and that means the time is now." He looked at her directly for the first time. He said, "I closed the wrong thing. I know that. I knew it when I sent the email. I've known it for 9 years, and I closed it anyway because I couldn't hold it open without explaining everything, and I wasn't ready to explain everything. But I'm ready now." He picked up his car keys from where he had set them on the desk. He looked at the stacks one more time. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame, the east door, the door that still remembered Margaret's work. He said, "She kept the records so someone would know what happened here. I kept the records so someone could do something about it. I think you're the someone." He did not say anything else. He went out through the east door, and it stuck slightly in the frame, the way it always did, and he put his shoulder into it, the way you learned to do if you had been in the building long enough, and then he was gone. Hazel stood at the circulation desk with the envelope in her hands. She looked at the stacks. She looked at Agnes's table. She picked up her phone. She dialed the county attorney's office, and when someone answered, she said, "My name is Hazel Cross. I'm the librarian at Berea Branch Library. I have documentation of a 7-year procurement fraud in the Madison County Library System totaling $89,412, and I need to speak with someone today." She said it clearly, without drama, with the specific steadiness of someone who has been preparing, without knowing it, for a very long time. The county attorney's office sent an investigator on a Thursday. His name was Paul Meredith, and he was 44 years old and had been with the office for 11 years, and he had the particular quality of stillness that people develop when their job requires them to listen to a great many things without reacting to them. He sat at the circulation desk with a yellow legal pad and asked questions in a flat, unhurried voice, and Hazel answered them the same way, and they worked through the documentation together for 3 hours, and at the end of it, he picked up the envelope with D. Albright's name on it and looked at it for a moment and said, "This is thorough," Hazel said. "It was compiled over 9 years." He looked at her. She said, "Not by me." She did not explain further. She did not need to. The records spoke in the order they had been assembled, and the order was its own explanation. And she had learned from the best librarian she had ever known that a well-organized collection required no introduction. Paul Meredith took the documentation and left a receipt and said he would be in touch. He was in touch 6 days later. Dennis Albright was placed on administrative leave pending investigation on a Tuesday morning. The county issued a statement the following Thursday that said very little in a great many words, the way official statements do. But what it said, beneath the language of ongoing review and appropriate action, was that something had been found and someone was going to be held accountable for it, and the process was now in motion and could not be stopped. Bradford Hayes was not named in the statement. Hazel had not named him to Paul Meredith. She had given the investigator the documentation Bradford had assembled, the 9 years of records, and she had described finding it in the archive room, which was true, and she had said that the records appeared to have been compiled by a party who had become aware of the fraud and had been documenting it over time, which was also true, and she had let the documentation speak for itself, the way Margaret would have. She did not know what Paul Meredith had concluded about Bradford Hayes. She did not call Bradford to ask. She did not hear from him. She thought about him sometimes in the weeks that followed, thought about him the way you think about a complicated equation that you have done correctly but whose answer still surprises you. A result that is both inevitable and unexpected. He had been wrong about the building. He had been right about everything underneath it. The closure notice had given the branch 3 weeks. On the second week, Agnes Wheeler came in on a Tuesday morning, as she always did, and sat at her table by the east window and did not read. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the stacks and did not say anything for a while. Agnes said, without preamble, "What happens to the books?" "Central Library takes what they can use," Hazel said. "The rest goes to the county school system or gets sold at the Friends sale in the spring." Agnes was quiet. She said, "And the building?" "County facilities," Hazel said. "For evaluation." Agnes turned and looked at the room, slowly, the way she had looked at things for 80 years, with the complete attention of someone who had learned that looking carefully at something was a form of respect for it. She said, "Margaret would have known what to do." Hazel looked up from the shelf. She thought about the archive. She thought about the index card that said you found the room. That means you were supposed to. She thought about the annotation in the margin that said she became what she was always going to become. She said, "I think I do." She had called the county attorney's office on a Thursday. On the following Monday, she had called the Kentucky Department for Libraries and Archives. On the Wednesday after that, she had driven to Frankfurt and sat in an office with a program officer named Carolyn Tate, who had short gray hair and a coffee mug that said, "Read more," and who listened to everything Hazel said with the attention of someone who had been waiting to hear exactly this kind of thing for a long time. Hazel laid out the documentation, the archive, the 47 years of textbook fund records, the community fund Bradford Hayes had maintained, the 312 names, the building, Est. 1971, with the archive room installed 9 years before it opened. Carolyn Tate looked at the list of 312 names. She turned the pages slowly. She said, "How many of these people still live in Berea?" Hazel said, "I don't know yet. I've been working on it." She had been working on it. She had started with the names she recognized and worked outward, calling people she knew, asking carefully, not explaining everything yet, but asking enough that people understood something was happening and that their history with the branch was part of it. The response had surprised her. Not the willingness, exactly. What surprised her was the specificity of what they remembered. The exact book. The exact year. The woman behind the desk who had handed it to them without asking where the money came from. The way it had felt to come back to the branch later, as adults, as parents, with their own children, and find it still there, still open, still smelling the same. They had all thought it was just the library. They had not known it was also a woman who had spent 47 years making sure they had what they needed, quietly, without credit, without any expectation of return. Carolyn Tate made 3 calls from her office while Hazel sat across the desk and waited. The first call was to the Kentucky Heritage Council. The second was to a foundation officer in Louisville. The third was to someone whose name Carolyn did not say. She hung up and looked at Hazel. She said, "The building can be nominated for the State Historic Register." The archive alone would qualify it, but the community fund records and the paper trail make it exceptional. And there's a program for exactly this kind of community library. Independent operation, partial state support, the community raises the rest. It's been done in 4 other counties in the last decade. She said, "It's not easy." Hazel said, "I know." Carolyn looked at her for a moment. She said, "You've been a librarian for 30 years. Hazel said, "Yes." Carolyn said, "You understand this would be a different job, more administrative, more fundraising." Hazel said, "I understand." Carolyn picked up her coffee mug and looked at it and set it down. She said, "Okay, let's talk about what you need." Bradford Hayes came to the branch on a Wednesday morning in early December, 3 days before the scheduled closing date, 2 days before the community meeting Hazel had not yet told him about. She was at the circulation desk when he came through the front door. He was wearing the gray version of the fleece quarter zip. He stopped just inside the entrance and looked at the room the way people look at places they have thought about more than they have visited. He said, "I heard you found the archive room." She said, "Yes." He stood there for a moment. He was not looking at her. He said, "I went in there in 2014, 6 months after Margaret died. I found everything she had kept." Hazel said, "I know." He nodded. He walked past the circulation desk toward the back hallway, slowly, and she let him go. She heard the shelving unit move, the familiar sound of it rolling on the linoleum, and then silence. He was in there for 11 minutes. She did not follow him. She stayed at the desk and did not try to imagine what he was doing. She had learned in 30 years at this desk that there were things people needed to do alone in a room, and that the kindest thing you could offer was the room. When he came back through the hallway, his face was the same. He stopped at the circulation desk again. He picked up the date stamp from the tray where she had left it. He turned it in his hand once. He set it down. He said, "The building is the point. I know that now. I think I knew it then." He did not say anything else. He went out through the front door and she heard his car start in the lot and she did not watch him go. She picked up the date stamp and put it back where it belonged. The community meeting was held on a Friday evening, the last week of November, 3 days before the branch was scheduled to close. Hazel had sent letters. She had called people. She had asked Agnes to make calls, and Agnes had made them with the efficiency of someone who had been the connective tissue of a community for 50 years and knew exactly who needed to know what and in what order. 43 people came. The branch held 20 comfortably. They pulled chairs from the workroom in the back hallway and the archive room, which Hazel had opened for the first time to people other than herself. And people sat in the stacks and on the floor and stood 3 deep near the door. The fluorescent in the back corner flickered for 30 seconds before it caught, and then the room was fully lit, and Hazel stood at the front of it and looked at the faces. She read from the list. She did not read all 312 names. She read the ones that were in the room. There were 14 people in that room on the list. She read all 14. Each time she read a name, the person it belonged to was quiet for a moment. Then several of them said something. Not to Hazel, exactly. To the room. To the air. A woman named Christine Alcott, who had driven down from Lexington when Agnes called her, said, "I thought the school gave out those books. I thought it was just a program." A man named Marcus Webb, who ran a contracting business in Richmond, said, "I went back to school because of those books. I mean, I went back because I went back." But he stopped. He started again. "I didn't know somebody paid for them. I thought I just got lucky." An older man in the back, whose name Hazel had not recognized when he came in, stood up when she finished reading the list and said, "My name's not on there, but my mother's is. Edna Pruitt, 1971. She used to come in here every week. She talked about this library until the day she died. She said it was the realest place in town." Never knew why she said it that way. "I think I do know." He sat back down. Agnes said, from her table by the east window, in her ordinary speaking voice, "The building is the point. You know, you can't have what this place was without the place. That's just how it is." The room was quiet for a moment. Then a woman near the door said, "What do we need to do?" They raised $4,230 that evening. Not from anyone wealthy. From the 14 people on the list and the 29 who weren't, people pulling out wallets and writing checks on the circulation desk and handing Hazel folded cash with the specific decisiveness of people who have just understood something and want to act on it before the understanding fades. $4,230 $230 was not enough to keep a library open. It was enough to begin. The branch did not close on schedule. The county, presented with a historic nomination filing and a community petition with 214 signatures and a letter from the Kentucky Department for Libraries and Archives, agreed to a 90-day extension. The 90 days became 6 months. The 6 months became a funding cycle. The funding cycle became, in the particular slow way that institutional decisions become permanent, the new normal. Hazel did not stop working the stacks during any of it. She did not stop dusting on Wednesdays. She did not stop knowing which shelf in the reference section needed the bracket tightened. She opened the archive room to researchers in January. A graduate student from the University of Kentucky spent 2 weeks in the room in February and wrote a paper about it that used the phrase, "unprecedented record of sustained community philanthropy." The paper was published in a journal that 800 people read. One of those 800 people sent a copy to the foundation in Louisville that Carolyn Tate had called, and the foundation made a site visit in March. In April, they approved a 3-year grant that covered operating costs, collection maintenance, and 1 full-time staff position. Agnes came in every Tuesday and Thursday. She brought her granddaughter in the spring, a girl of 9 who had recently read everything in the children's section and come to the desk and asked what came next. Hazel had looked at her for a moment. Then she reached under the desk and pulled out a book she had been holding for exactly this occasion, because she had known this occasion was coming, the way you know things when you have been paying attention long enough. The girl took the book and went to the table by the east window and sat down with her hands flat on either side of it, the way Agnes sat, the same quality of attention, skipping a generation and landing whole. Hazel watched her for a moment. Then she went back to work. The community dinner was held in May. In the branch, the shelves pushed back to make room for tables borrowed from the Methodist Church 2 blocks over. 47 people came. Someone brought a ham. Someone else brought 3 pies. The woman with the 2 small children came again. The children slightly larger now, running between the table legs while the adults talked. Marcus Webb drove down from Richmond with his wife and his youngest son, who was 12, and had just started coming to the branch on his own on Wednesday afternoons because his mother worked second shift and the branch was warm and had outlets. Christine Alcott came from Lexington with her mother, a woman in her 70s who had never been in the branch before and who walked through the stacks slowly, running her hand along the shelves the way you touch something you have been told about for your whole life and are finally allowed to see. The man from the back of the meeting, whose mother's name was on the list, came with his own family. He had brought a photograph. It was a photograph of his mother, Edna Pruitt, taken sometime in the 1970s, standing in front of the branch on Chestnut Street, squinting slightly in the light, one hand raised against the sun. He gave it to Hazel at the end of the evening without explanation. She understood that it was for the archive. She put it in a new box, a clean one, and labeled it in her own hand, and set it on the bottom shelf of the archive room next to the box marked FOR THE next ONU. She left room on the shelf for more. Agnes stayed until the end. When the last person had gone and the tables were back at the Methodist Church and the stacks were restored to their proper order, she sat at her table by the east window in the chair at its particular angle and looked at the room. She said, "Margaret would have been satisfied." Hazel said, "I think so." Agnes said, "She wouldn't have made a fuss about it. She would have come in the next morning and opened up and started on whatever needed doing." Hazel said, "Yes." Agnes picked up her canvas tote and her coat and stood. She said, "Same time Thursday." She went out through the east door, which still required a shoulder, and Hazel heard it close behind her, the familiar resistance and then the catch. She stood alone in the branch. The fluorescent in the back corner was humming. The shelves were straight. The circulation desk was clear. The crossword book Agnes had left on the reading table had 3 squares unfinished, the same 3 squares Agnes left unfinished every week, a private habit Hazel had never asked about and never would. She went to the window in the east wall and looked out at Chestnut Street in the May evening, the light going long and gold across the sidewalk, a boy on a bicycle moving slowly past, the maples coming back in full and casting the street in the particular green of early summer that made everything look like it had been washed. She thought about Margaret Oakes, who had stood at this window for 47 years, who had fixed the east door and tightened the shelf bracket and kept the heat manageable and bought books for children who needed them and kept records of every child, every book, every year, and had sealed the records in a room and given a key to an old woman and said, "You'll know when the time comes." She thought about Bradford Hayes, who who had read those records and continued them and said, I know, like he'd been saying it to himself for a long time, and who had built a paper trail with the specific precision of someone who had decided that if they could not act yet, they would at least make sure that acting would be possible when someone else arrived who could. She thought about the list. 312 names. The girl who was 8 years old in 1978 and couldn't reach the door handle. She looked at the street for a long time. Then she went to the desk and pulled out the logbook. The same kind Margaret had used. The same black cover. The same cream-ruled pages. And she opened it to the first blank page and wrote the date in the upper right corner and began the day's entry. She wrote what she wrote every day. Hours open. Patrons served. Collection activity. Any maintenance issues noted for follow-up. The ordinary record of an ordinary day in a library that had been, for a very long time, more than anyone outside it had understood. She wrote it in full. She closed the logbook. She turned off the lights in the back hallway. She turned off the lights in the stacks, section by section, moving toward the front of the building. She turned off the fluorescent in the back corner last, and it dimmed slowly the way it always had, taking its time going dark. She locked the front door. She stood on the step for a moment in the May evening. Then she walked to her car and got in and looked at the building through the windshield, the cream-painted brick, the letters above the door, the archive room below it where the light had been off for 62 years before she found the switch. She thought, a library is not a building. And then she thought, but it is also a building. It is also exactly this building, this door, this window, this street, this smell, this particular quality of light in late afternoon when the maples are full and the boy on the bicycle goes past and the town looks like it has been washed. It is the building and everything the building made possible, and you cannot have the second without the first. And anyone who tells you otherwise has not sat in the right chair at the right table and felt the specific weight of finding out that someone held the door open for you, quietly, from a distance, for 30 years, without ever intending for you to know. She started the car. She drove home through the May evening, the long light moving across the fields at the edge of town, the first fireflies starting in the low places along the road, the air through the window carrying the smell of cut grass and coming rain, and the particular sweetness of Kentucky in early summer that she had known her whole life and had never once had to be taught to love. If this story stayed with you today, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for a new story every week, and leave a comment. Is there a place in your life, a library, a classroom, a corner of a town that held a door open for you before you knew you needed one? A library is not a building. It is a promise that no child will be left without a door. Margaret Oak spent 47 years keeping that promise. Hazel Cross spent 30 years living inside it, without ever knowing who had built it for her.